مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. تهديد الكبتاغون لمحة عن التجارة غير المشروعة واستهلاكها والحقائق الإقليمية، عنوان بحث أكاديمي استغرق 3 سنوات في المراقبة عن كثب لتجارة الكبتاغون في المنطقة، وخلص إلى ارتفاع وتيرة التهريب بمعدل ينذر بالخطر. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة تنضم إلينا كاورلين روز، كبيرة الباحثين في معهد نيو لاينز للدراسات السياسية والمشاركة في إعداد هذا البحث. كارولين، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you so much for having me.
كارولين، خلص بحثكم إلى أن هذه هي التجارة غير المشروعة لم تعد سوقا تقتصر على سوريا أو منطقة الشام، بل هي تحد يمتد عبر منطقة البحر الأبيض المتوسط والخليج. هل لك أن تشرحي لنا بداية ذلك؟
Absolutely. So the Captagon trade, particularly over the last 3 years, has mushroomed into a trade that has industrial sized production and trafficking capacity. We've seen Captagon traded through maritime commercial routes and then also find new transit routes throughout the region. And while it was always a popular production hub in the Levant, in Lebanon and Syria, we're starting to see the Captagon train boom outside of the region and reach existing destination markets in the Persian Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also identify new transit and transshipment hubs in the Mediterranean, such as in Southern Europe, for example, Romania, Greece, and Italy, or even countries in Africa as well, we found to have transshipment sites. And so Captagon is really becoming a popular drug, but also a widely circulated drug in the region.
هل النظام السوري مرتبط بهذه التجارة غير المشروعة؟
It definitely is. Many actors that are directly affiliated with the trade, and then also, of course, actors that are affiliated with specifically the 4th Division, have played a very key role in establishing manufacturing centers, such as factories and manufacturing warehouses, but then also, of course, have played a role in production and trafficking of Captagon, using state-controlled ports that would usually require ministerial level approval to dispatch these Captagon shipments. And we've seen evidence of 4th Division officials and other officials that are very closely correlated and related to the Assad regime, monitoring tax and checkpoints, also, of course, border patrol crossovers and a number of other sites where Captagon has of course, traveled through. And this is incredibly important when trying to find the actors engaged in the in the Captagon trade.
ما حجم هذه التجارة في سوريا ولبنان؟ هل لديكم أرقام؟
Unfortunately, it's really difficult to identify the level of Captagon tablets that are present in these countries. However, the report did identify these 2 countries as the major production hubs. Syria, especially, Syria has the greatest industrial size capacity, with a lot of these production centers centered in the Latakia province, but then also, of course, in other hubs like Dara and Sueda. However, Lebanon is also host to a number of smaller scale and medium scale, more mobile Captagon laboratories that tend to transfer between the Syrian border and the Lebanese border based on when interdiction risks are high. They have we've calculated about 20 small scale Captagon production labs that again are very mobile in Lebanon, and then 15 large scale Captagon production labs in Syria. We unfortunately don't know the number of Captagon pills that are produced. We only know what we've been seeing seized.
أين يذهب كبتاغون سوريا ولبنان تحديداً؟ ما هي الوجهة؟
Usually it goes to destination markets in the Persian Gulf. And even when we've seen Captagon shipments land in strange and random places, for example, the port of Klang as far east as Malaysia, usually its intended destination, its end destination is in the Persian Gulf, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So usually that's where these Captagon shipments are sent. That being said, as Captagon becomes more popular, as more Captagon is sent through these transshipment hubs, there are going to be more consumers that might flock to Captagon and establish transnational criminal organizations that will look to traffic Captagon in new markets and seek to create new demand. I also think it's very important to know that, yes, while certainly Lebanon does have Captagon production, it's very prevalent. It is very important to remember that their production is much more prominent and much more high in Syria.
ما مدى تورط حزب الله والميليشيات المسلحة في تهريبه وترويجه في المنطقة؟
Incredibly closely. Hezbollah plays a very key role in facilitating the transportation of Captagon, as well as, of course, providing protection to these smaller scale mobile Captagon laboratories that are concentrated near the Kalmoun mountain range, near the Syrian and Lebanese border. They also, of course, provide a lot of assistance in allowing Captagon shipments, whether transported from Syria or from some of these smaller scale Captagon labs in Lebanon, and providing access to ports, for example, the port of Beirut or the port in Tripoli, or informal ports that are along the Lebanese Mediterranean coast. And this has been something that has been key in facilitating the Captagon trade's regional expansion, and then of course access to Persian Gulf destination countries.
كل هذا يدفعني إلى سؤال: كيف كانت مهمة جمع المعلومات والحقائق لهذا البحث في مناطق غير مستقرة كسوريا والعراق ولبنان؟
First, of course, the fact that we're talking about Syria, where information and data is so difficult to obtain, and there's a reason why this project took 3 years. But I'd also like to say that this research builds off of a lot of existing research and existing data that just never was cited, and a lot of data that was out there, firsthand accounts, interviews, and other reports and literature, medical peer-reviewed medical journals as well, about Captagon, about its health effects, that just never was circulated. And so really what we wanted to do with this report was, of course, conduct our own research and conduct our own investigative analysis, but then also, of course, bring about and elevate the existing work that was out there about the Captagon trade, and really elevate some of these voices that were local voices and give them a larger platform to which they can educate the public about the Captagon trade.
بحثكم يذكر أن إنتاج الكبتاغون في سوريا تحول من عمليات فردية إلى أخرى ممنهجة وأكثر تنظيما. كيف ذلك؟
So in the mid-2010s, Captagon was formally almost exclusively associated with the Islamic State, and the Islamic State using this as kind of a combat enhancer, a fighting drug, where the effects of Captagon would help fighters stay up and become more violent and stave hunger and really enhance their fighting capabilities. But also at the same time, Captagon was being produced at a much more local level, sometimes individually or within smaller communities throughout Syria. And so in both regime-held and rebel-held areas, you would see warlords profiteering off of Captagon, but much smaller sizes of Captagon shipments. And while certainly the Persian Gulf was a destination country where Captagon would be sold at very high prices, like $15 per pill, consumption was prevalent in Syria at the time. Now we've started to see Captagon seizures. It's no longer strange to see a Captagon seizure of 2 billion tablets in Saudi Arabia, all in one attempt. Or in some cases in Malaysia, in their Port of Klang seizure last year, it was 94.8 million tablets that were seized, all in one attempt. That demonstrates a very organized, sophisticated, and advanced production capacity, and also the transportation networks that are facilitating this shipment. And of course, that also, of course, if for those reading in between the lines, it also, of course, points to state involvement, because no non-state actor in Syria, including Lebanon, they don't have the capacity to undertake such a large-scale shipment of that size. ISIS is not able to do that, and many of these other non-state actors within Syria, including rebel organizations and other terrorist organizations, they don't have the type of resources and capacity to do that, let alone access to many of these ports. So that was a really, really big indicator of state involvement, but also, of course, an organized and intentional mandate to really carry out the Captagon trade.
هل تخبرينني أن لبنان الحكومة متورطة في الأمر؟
No, more so of the Syrian government. I think with the Lebanese government, it's a bit more of a complex dynamic with Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, has a great involvement in the trade and facilitating the trade. And given the political dynamics and sensitivity of their relationship with Hezbollah, it's been very difficult for the Lebanese government to really disrupt the Captagon trade. But they have, of course, been trying to conduct as many seizures as possible. But it's very difficult for the Lebanese government, given the prevalence of corruption and how deep the influence of Hezbollah is in the country.
ما هي وسائل تهريب الكبتاغون؟ ما أغرب الطرق التي استوقفتكم أثناء إجراء هذا البحث؟
Absolutely. That's a great question. Every day they've surprised me, and I've had a tracker of all of the seizures, and it's been incredibly impressive in some cases of the methods that many of these smugglers have used to traffic Captagon out of Syria and out of Lebanon. I've seen what seems like everything under the sun. I've seen Captagon tablets hidden inside of mosaic tiles, inside of pickles, inside of tomato paste jar lids, inside of metal sheets and iron sheets, inside of the bodies of cars, inside of oranges, inside of fake plastic oranges. Probably some of the most surprising ones, of course, were Captagon tablets hidden inside of the intestines of livestock, inside of sheep that was along the Kuwait and Iraq border. There was one incident where Captagon was hidden inside of pizza ovens and tumbler dryers. So these I could go on, but these smugglers really do invent new ways. They're sophisticated, they're advanced. And even some of the trade restrictions that have been imposed on certain countries, for example, Lebanon, that really has not deterred these smugglers. They really do find every way that they can to make sure that Captagon shipments are arriving.
تعتقدين أن الجهود في دول الخليج لمحاربة هذه الآفة بحجم التحديات؟
I think certainly when it comes to interdiction efforts, I think without a doubt, particularly in the Persian Gulf, these law enforcement systems, particularly Saudi Arabia's Zakat system, has been incredibly vigilant in trying to identify and intercept Captagon shipments. And when these smugglers are sending Captagon tablets by the millions, I think it's made it a bit easier to detect these shipments. That being said, there are a lot of shipments that are going not detected. And so really this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so when we see such successive attempts to try and get such large shipments through, it begs the question of, are shipments of this size also getting through at other ports or with other customs authorities that we just don't know about or go underreported? And of course, there's no way to really know for sure, but I think that certainly there is a level of corruption that might facilitate the Captagon trade, of course, successfully getting these tablets in. I also think that there's been a huge emphasis on the law enforcement aspect of the Captagon trade and not a lot of attention paid to the demand side.
مضطرة إلى أن ألفت هنا أغلب دول الخليج أوقفت الصادرات الزراعية من لبنان وليس لديها علاقات تجارية في الوقت الحالي مع سوريا. كيف يصل الكبتاغون إذن؟
So for a while it was through Lebanon, and I think that Lebanon has been a really key transit route and a place to dispatch Captagon shipments from these ports, whether through maritime routes, but then also, of course, land routes. I think that has been important. It's notable, though, that Saudi Arabia imposed a ban on Lebanese agricultural produce back in the spring of 2021. And then later in the fall of 2021, a blanket ban on all Lebanese imports into Saudi Arabia. And I think that Saudi Arabia decided to impose this ban thinking that it would stem Captagon from flowing into their borders, and it didn't. In fact, Captagon, both in agricultural produce and other products as well, continues to flow into Saudi Arabia, and we're seeing still a really big increase in Captagon shipments. I also think that smugglers have started to use other transit routes as well. One, of course, and something that's been concerning me as a researcher is Iraq. We've seen a huge uptick in Captagon shipments that have been flowing between the Syrian and Iraqi border along the Al-Qaim highway. and routing that back into Saudi Arabia directly, or for example, through the Kuwait-Iraq border, as we saw, of course, with the sheep incident. We've also seen, especially after the Jaber Nasib border crossing and its opening last fall, we've seen a huge influx in Captagon shipments between the Syrian and Jordanian border. And these have even sparked clashes between Jordanian security forces and the smugglers that have been trying to attempt to get Captagon and hashish palms and a number of other substances across the border.
إذا أردنا كشف الصورة بالأرقام، ما هي قيمة تجارة الكبتاغون في الشرق الأوسط؟
Through the years, I think I could give you a better idea in terms of its value, its market value. So for example, in 2017, the Captagon trade was worth almost worth $1 billion. In 2020, there was a study conducted by the Center for Operational Analysis and Research, CORE, that put out an excellent report on a market estimate of the trade being worth $3.46 billion. And then the recent New Lines report put out a more recent estimation of the Captagon trade's value in just 2021 alone, and that was $5.7 billion. And I would like to caveat and say that, the numbers are very difficult in that I think everyone gets very fixated on them, but they only represent the tip of the iceberg. They only represent the seizures that have been recorded and reported by governments officially through state media sites. And there are a lot of seizures that go undetected, seizures that are not reported, and then Captagon shipments that go undetected by law enforcement and of course are trickling into the market. So there's a lot more Captagon tablets out there that we just did not account for when we put together this value. We just put the value of what was seized. And of course, that only represents just a percentage of what really is out there. So likely the Captagon trade is worth well over $5.7 billion.
لابد أن نسأل هنا عن الحلول. تحدثتم في بحثكم عن الحاجة المتزايدة لمنتدى متوسط وخليجي إقليمي بالمساعدة وكالات إنفاذ القانون والباحثين لتصميم استجابة منسقة لهذه التجارة غير المشروعة. ما آلية تحقيق ذلك؟
So I think that really what needs to happen, there needs to be regional dialogue, and there needs to be a formal or informal mechanism that's established between transit and destination countries that are affected by the Captagon trade and are very concerned about it. This, of course, would include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and Iraq, as well as other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, in Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Romania, countries in Northern Africa, Egypt. They've received a lot of Captagon shipments lately. And so a number of countries that have demonstrated concern about the Captagon trade have also exhibited efforts to counter the Captagon trade, to intercept it. And then, of course, are trying to actively push against production sites. So, of course, Syria may be excluded from this mechanism just for that very reason. The government is very involved in Captagon production. And this mechanism would be to share best practices, to share information, to really exchange in a dialogue about Captagon's detrimental health effects, to share medical information about rehabilitation services, access to mental health care and to physical health care as well. And I really think that this is incredibly important for the region, especially as Captagon is really starting to have a devastating effect on the mental health, on the healthcare and the human security landscapes in the region.
الولايات المتحدة والدول الغربية معنية باستراتيجية تعطيل الشبكات الإجرامية المتورطة في هذه التجارة، أم أن الأمر لا يعنيها لأن التهديد لا يشملها حتى الآن؟
I think certainly this is something that has demonstrably concerned the United States and its partners, particularly in the EU. For the EU, of course, the fact that many of its own members, particularly in the Southern Mediterranean, are on the front lines of interdicting and countering the Captagon trade Italy, Greece, Romania, a number of its member states, even France, they've all received a Captagon shipment at one point. Even as far north as Austria in Salzburg, they've also been affected by the Captagon trade in some shape or form. And so I think that it's very concerning on a level of it's hitting home, but then also, of course, concerning on a level that Captagon is changing the security landscape in the Middle East. And if we want a stable Middle East, if we want to ensure human security, if we want to, of course, provide access to mental health care, to access to healthcare, and ensure that these malign actors are not profiting off of a trade like Captagon, this is something that should be concerning and should be of interest to the EU and to the United States. And I think for the United States, this has presented a really great avenue for the US to engage with its partners in the Middle East on different ways that it can hold the Assad regime accountable and hold other actors accountable that have been placed on US sanctions lists, and also, of course, actors that have challenged US interests in the region, for example, Hezbollah and the IRGC. And so really, I do think that this has concerned US policymakers, and it has been something that has caught their attention.
شكرا كارولين روز، كبيرة الباحثين في معهد نيو لاينز للدراسات السياسية، للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you so much for having me. شكرا. Thank you.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.